Dust swirled in choking spirals across the Silver Ridge station yard as the noon sun bore down mercilessly on the crowd. Wagons rattled, horses stamped and snorted, and the sour reek of sweat, tobacco, and spilled whiskey hung in the air. The center of it all, Eve Morrison stood trembling, clutching a small satchel that contained the last remnants of her life. Her black dress, once neat, was sun-bleached and threadbare. Her veil had long since frayed, and her boots showed cracks, where the leather had given up its fight with the dust. She had buried her husband a year ago, buried the dream of a settled life with him, and buried the fragile security she thought widowhood might at least provide. Now, she found herself on display, like livestock in a corral, with the jeers of strangers breaking over her like waves. "She can't even keep a man alive," one voice called from the saloon porch. A burst of cruel laughter followed. "A widow with nothing but bones to boil," another man sneered, spitting into the dirt. "Maybe she should beg the mine. Company for scraps. They'll find a use for her." The words cut deeper than whips. Eve lowered her eyes, praying the shame wouldn't spill down her cheeks as tears. She had promised herself she would endure this. Just one more humiliation, one more day to claw her way toward dignity. But standing alone before so many judging faces, her spirit wavered. The train that had brought her here had already vanished into the horizon, carrying off any chance of retreat. She had come to Silver Ridge on the frail hope of work, of a position cooking for a family who needed an extra pair of hands. But even hope was a fragile thread, too easily snapped by ridicule. At the far edge of the yard, children huddled together, whispering. 6 of them, thin and restless, their faces sunburned and patched with dirt. Their eyes flicked to her in curiosity, then quickly darted away. She recognized them, the Sullivan children. They were the reason she had come here, the reason she had written to the ranch. Their father, Jacob Sullivan, had lost his wife 2 winters back. He had asked the church if they could send help, someone to cook, clean, and tend. Eve had offered herself, desperate for purpose. But in this moment, under the weight of mockery, she wondered if even they would turn her away. The sound of boots striking earth pulled her attention. The crowd's laughter quieted. Heads turned. Jacob Sullivan strode forward from where his wagon waited by the hitching post. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his sunburnt skin etched by years of toil. His clothes were plain, faded work shirt, dusty trousers, boots that had seen better, seasons, but his presence commanded notice. His eyes, steel gray and watchful, swept over the crowd with calm, unyielding authority. He did not speak. He did not need to. Jacob stopped before Eve. His gaze lingered on her trembling hands, her satchel clutched like a lifeline, the faint tremor in her stance. Then he turned his head slightly, scanning the mocking faces around them. The silence stretched taut. Finally, with a measured motion, he extended his hand to her. The gesture was simple, wordless, yet it cut through the jeers like a blade. For a heartbeat, Eve could not move. The shame in her chest roared louder than the crowd, louder than the wind. To take his hand meant surrendering the last of her independence. It meant stepping into a life of strangers, of unknown demands, of children who might resent her. But to refuse was to accept ruin. Her fingers loosened from the satchel. Strap. Slowly, uncertainly, she placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused, strong, steady. He did not smile, did not offer comfort, but his grip anchored her like a stone in a storm. Without a word, Jacob turned and led her through the parting crowd. The children fell in behind them, silent, their eyes wide. The mocking voices had quieted into mutters, their cruelty stripped of power in the face of Jacob's silent defiance. They reached the wagon. Eve climbed aboard, clutching her satchel tightly as if it might dissolve into dust if she let go. Jacob checked the harness, adjusted the reins, and with a flick, The horses pulled them away from the station yard. The sound of the crowd faded behind them, replaced by the creak of wheels and the rhythm of hooves striking the hard-packed earth. Eve sat stiffly on the wooden bench, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Jacob drove without a word. The children sat in the back, whispering in low voices she could not quite catch. The air between them was heavy, not hostile, but untested, like ground that had yet to feel a plow. The land stretched wide before them, rolling hills, scorched gold by the sun, cut by deep arroyos and scattered mesquite. It was a hard land, unforgiving, but it had a strange beauty. Somewhere out there, Jacob's homestead waited, and with it, the chance for Eve to carve a place in the world again. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing a long, shaky breath. She had survived worse than this. She would survive this too. But she did not yet know, could not yet know, that this harsh beginning would one day soften into something else entirely. That these children, wary and restless, would learn to call her Mama. That this silent man, who had spoken no words to her yet, would one day speak vows that bound them in something deeper than duty. For now, all she could do was sit in silence, the echo of jeers still ringing in her ears, and cling to the faintest spark of hope. And so began the story of Eve Morrison, widow, wanderer, teacher, cook, and the family who would become her salvation. The Sullivan homestead sat at the edge of a wide basin, framed by cottonwoods and the slow crawl of a shallow creek. The house was rough-hewn timber, patched with years of repairs, the roofline uneven but sturdy. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, carrying the smell of wood ash and stew long since simmered away. The barn leaned slightly but stood strong against the wind, and the corral held 2 tired horses and a pair of milk cows. To Eve, riding up in Jacob's wagon, it looked less like a home and more like a test. She tightened her grip on the satchel, in her lap. This was no boarding house kitchen, no genteel post of labor where wages were neat and hours predictable. This was survival carved from earth and sweat. Jacob halted the wagon. The children scrambled down, their bare feet kicking up dust. They scattered like sparrows, some running for the barn, others for the creek. Only the eldest boy lingered, a tall lad of about 12 with his father's gray eyes and a wary set to his jaw. He stood stiffly by the wagon, studying Eve with the kind of scrutiny that weighed heavier than the station crowd's ridicule. "This is Daniel," Jacob said flatly, his voice gravel rough from disuse. "He's the eldest. You'll see to him same as the rest." It was the first time Jacob had spoken directly to her. The words were not warm, but they were grounding. Eve nodded faintly. "I will." The boy said nothing. His eyes flicked to her satchel, then to her worn dress, and finally back to her face. 1,000 unspoken questions lingered there. Who are you? Why are you here? Will you stay? Will you leave? She wanted to answer them, but her throat closed. Instead, she climbed down from the wagon and followed Jacob into the house. Inside, the kitchen told the story of absence. The hearth was cold, ashes clinging to the grate. Pans sat unwashed in the corner. The table bore the scars of knives and spills, sticky with remnants of meals hurriedly eaten. A loaf of bread, hard as stone, sat forgotten on a plate. Eve set her satchel down and pressed her hand to the table, steadying herself. "I'll begin here," she whispered. Jacob nodded once, already turning toward the door. "Children will need feeding before nightfall. You'll find what you need in the pantry." And then he was gone, leaving her in silence broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the eaves. Eve stood there a long moment, staring at the cold hearth, the dirty pans, the cluttered shelves. She felt the weight of the house pressing down, the neglect, the grief, the absence of a woman's hand. It was as if sorrow had seeped into the timber itself. She pulled her sleeves back and set to work. Hours passed in a blur of motion. She scrubbed pots until her fingers blistered, swept the floors until the boards shone, and kneaded dough with the slow rhythm her mother had taught her in girlhood. The children drifted in one by one, watching curiously, whispering behind door frames. When the smell of rising bread filled the air, even Daniel's stern eyes softened, but her hands trembled with each task, betraying her exhaustion. She was not young anymore, not fresh-faced and strong. Widowhood and hunger had worn her thin, yet something in her pressed onward, perhaps pride, perhaps desperation, perhaps the stubborn will to prove she was not the useless thing the crowd at the station had named her. By dusk, the table was set. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, thick with potatoes and scraps of beef she'd found salted in the pantry. The bread cooled on the sill. She ladled portions into bowls, one for each child, one for Jacob, and, at last, one for herself. The children crowded at the table, their chatter hesitant, unsure if they were allowed such abundance. Jacob entered last, his face unreadable as he took his seat at the head. He glanced at the stew, at the bread, at Eve standing nervously with her hands clasped. He bowed his head briefly. "Lord, we thank you for the food before us." The children echoed, "Amen." Eve's chest tightened. She had not heard grace spoken in a long time. She sat and took her spoon. The stew was simple, but the warmth of it spread through her body like a balm. Halfway through the meal, the youngest child, a little girl with tangled blonde curls, looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Miss Eve, will you stay?" The question hung in the air. The chatter stilled. Even Jacob paused, his spoon resting halfway to his mouth. Eve swallowed hard. "If your father will have me, I'll stay as long as I'm needed." The girl's face brightened. She scooted closer, leaning against Eve's arm with the innocent trust of a child starved for comfort. Jacob's gaze lingered a moment longer before he returned to his stew. He said nothing, but something eased in his posture. A silent acknowledgement that, for tonight at least, order had returned to his table. After supper, Eve washed the bowls, her sleeves damp, her shoulders aching. The children drifted to their beds, the little girl lingering until Eve tucked her in. When the house finally quieted, she stepped outside onto the porch. The night was cool, the stars flung wide across the sky like silver dust. She breathed deeply, the scent of earth and wood smoke grounding her. Somewhere behind her, Jacob moved, about the barn, tending to chores. His silhouette crossed the lamplight, steady and solitary. Eve wrapped her arms around herself. This was not yet home. She was a stranger, a servant, a widow trying to stitch meaning back into the torn fabric of her life. But tonight she had fed the hungry, soothed a child, and lit a fire where there had been only cold ashes. It was a beginning. Fragile, uncertain, but a beginning. And though she did not know it yet, in the quiet bonds formed around that rough-hewn table, the shape of a family was already taking root. The days slipped into rhythm. Morning light spilled across the basin, pulling the family into the grind of ranch work. Jacob and the older boys rose before dawn to tend cattle and mend fences. The younger children scattered to chores, carrying water, gathering kindling, feeding hens. Eve kept to the kitchen, steady hands shaping bread, steady voice guiding little ones in letters and sums at the table once the dishes were cleared. Yet beneath the calm veneer, unease simmered. The Sullivan children watched her warily, testing boundaries in small, silent ways. Daniel, the eldest, carried his mother's absence like armor. His gray eyes judged her every move. When she tried to coax him into reading lessons, he muttered that ranch boys had no need for books. When she offered him a second helping at supper, he pushed the bowl back, muttering that she wasn't his mother. The words stung more than she let on. At night, when the house hushed and Jacob's boots echoed across the porch outside, she lay, awake staring at the rafters, battling the familiar whisper, "You don't belong, you never will." But belonging would not wait. It tested her sooner than she expected. It came with fever. One evening, as dusk fell heavy and the cicadas droned, little Anna, the curly-haired girl who had clung to Eve that first night, began to cough. At first it was light, a scratchy tickle as she helped fold linens. But by the time the lanterns burned low, her cheeks flushed red, her small body shivering beneath blankets. The cough deepened, rattling her chest until every breath sounded like a struggle for air. The household rippled with panic. The younger children whimpered in corners, whispering of sickness that stole mothers and brothers. Jacob's jaw tightened as he hovered near the bed, helpless, fists clenching and unclenching. "She was fine this morning," he muttered, voice hard with fear. "Now she burns like a coal. I'll fetch the doctor." But the doctor in Silver Ridge was 12 miles away, and the night was black. A storm had rolled in, lightning flashing across the basin, rain hammering the earth in torrents. To ride meant risking horse and rider both on flooded trails. Jacob glanced toward the door, torn between duty and danger. That's when Eve stepped forward. "No," she said softly but firmly. "If you leave, you won't make it back till dawn, and she may not last till then." Jacob's gaze snapped to hers, steel meeting fire. For a moment neither spoke, the storm outside filling the silence. "I've tended fever before," Eve continued, her hands already gathering cloths, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "My husband, he fell sick in the war years. I know the signs. We'll cool her, keep her chest clear, and pray she lasts through the night." Jacob's lips parted as if to argue, but then closed. He looked at Anna, then back at Eve. Finally, he gave a single curt nod. "Do what you can." Eve worked through the long hours. She boiled water, soaked cloths, laid them across the girl's forehead and wrists. She propped Anna up, spooning sips of willow bark tea past cracked lips. When the cough racked her, Eve held her gently, whispering lullabies long buried in her memory. The children hovered near, their fear thick as smoke. At one point, Daniel muttered, "When Ma took fever, she never came back." His voice cracked despite the defiance in his tone. Eve knelt before him, her own exhaustion carved deep in her eyes. "Your Ma isn't forgotten, Daniel. But right now, your sister needs us. She needs you. Will you fetch more firewood for me?" For the first time, the boy hesitated, then obeyed. The storm raged. Lightning flashed against the windows, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Hours crawled, like years. Eve's hands blistered from wringing cloths, her back ached from bending over the child's small frame. But she did not yield. Somewhere deep inside, past grief and shame, she found a wellspring of stubborn strength. Near dawn, the fever broke. Sweat poured down Anna's brow, her breathing eased into shallow but steady rhythm. Eve sagged in relief, tears stinging her eyes. She tucked the blanket around the girl and whispered a prayer of thanks. When Jacob returned from checking the barn, he paused in the doorway. His gaze softened as he saw Anna sleeping peacefully, Eve slumped beside, her bed hands still clasping a damp cloth. He said nothing, but the silence between them had shifted, less guarded, more reverent. Daniel too lingered in the corner, his eyes red from unshed tears, flicked to Eve. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Instead, he carried the water pail to the basin without being asked. It was not a word of acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. When morning light spilled across the basin, Silver Ridge would still be the same hard place. The same dust, the same jeers, the same mining men with their threats. But inside the Sullivan homestead, something had changed. Eve Morrison, once humiliated at the station yard, had faced her first true trial as part of this fractured family. And in the quiet triumph of a child's fever broken, she began to carve, her place not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as someone essential. What none of them knew was that this trial was only the first. Darker storms loomed, storms not of weather but of men and their greed. By midsummer, the rhythm of the Sullivan household had begun to mend. The kitchen glowed each morning with the smell of bread. The children, once wary, gathered eagerly for lessons, scratching letters onto scraps of paper as Eve guided their hands. Even Daniel's stiff resistance softened when she gave him responsibility, reading passages aloud for the younger ones, helping tally sums. Slowly, painfully, the jagged edges of grief smoothed into something like routine. But peace in Silver Ridge was fragile, and men like Theodore Jameson thrived on breaking fragile things. Jameson arrived on a sweltering afternoon, when the cattle lay under sparse shade and the air shimmered with heat. Eve noticed him first, his buggy polished, his suit immaculate despite the dust. He carried himself like a man accustomed to obedience, the kind whose smile was too sharp, whose eyes never softened. Jacob stepped out from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. The set of his shoulders stiffened when he saw the visitor. Eve, watching from the kitchen window, sensed the tension crackle between them. "Mr. Sullivan," Jameson greeted, his tone oily. "A fine day, isn't it? I hear your household has expanded." His gaze flicked toward the house, lingering, where Eve stood. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Jacob's reply was curt. "State your business." Jameson chuckled, waving a hand as though shooing away Jacob's brusqueness. "I represent the Western Mining Consortium. As you know, we employ most of Silver Ridge. The future of this territory rests on our efforts, which is why I've come to speak about the school your housekeeper has begun." Eve's stomach nodded. She hadn't meant for it to be a school. It had started with teaching the Sullivan children their letters. Then neighbors had asked if their little ones might join. Then miners' children had come too. Soon, a dozen boys and girls sat cross-legged on the floor each morning, eager eyes turned toward her chalk slate. She had thought of it as kindness. But to men like Jameson, kindness was defiance. Jacob's jaw clenched. "What of it?" Jameson spread his arms, his voice smooth as silk. "The consortium offers generous pay for teachers. We'll provide books, supplies, even a proper building. All we ask is that our curriculum be taught faithfully. Discipline, obedience, arithmetic suited for the minds. We cannot have children wasting time on lofty ideals when their families depend on their wages." The meaning cut sharp. They wanted Eve to shape the children into laborers, docile, unthinking, chained to the mines. Eve stepped out onto the porch, her hands trembling, though she held them steady at her sides. "And if I refuse?" Jameson's eyes gleamed. "Then you are operating an unlicensed school. The law would be on our side to close it, and the church's blessing won't help much if the consortium withdraws its tithe." Jacob moved closer, his presence looming between Jameson and the house. His voice was low, dangerous. "You've said your piece. Now get off my land." For the first time, Jameson's smile faltered. He studied Jacob, measuring him, then turned back to Eve. "Think carefully, Mrs. Morrison. You have no husband, no standing, no protection. Do you truly want to gamble the children's futures on stubborn pride?" The words struck deep, for they cut close to truth. Eve's hands tightened into fists at her sides. Memories of the station crowd's jeers flared in her mind. But before the shame could overwhelm her, Jacob spoke again, firm, unyielding. "She's under my roof. That means she has all the standing she needs." Silence stretched. The cicadas buzzed. The children, gathered at the window, pressed close to one another, their eyes wide. Jameson finally tipped his hat, though his smile did not return. "Very well, Mr. Sullivan. But understand, men who defy the consortium seldom prosper." With that, he turned, climbed into his buggy, and rolled away in a cloud of dust. When he was gone, Eve's legs weakened. She gripped the porch rail to steady herself. "He'll be back," she whispered. Jacob glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Aye, but so will we." For the first time since she had met him, Eve caught a flicker of something beyond duty in his eyes, something fierce, protective, unspoken. She nodded, drawing strength from it. That night, after the children were tucked in, Eve sat by the fire. Her hands still shook from Jameson's threats, but her heart burned with resolve. She had tasted humiliation before. She had lived under scorn. But now there were children who looked to her, children who believed her lessons mattered. And Jacob's silent defiance told her she was not standing alone. She whispered into the flickering glow, "I will not yield. Not again." The storm was only beginning. But the widow who had arrived in Silver Ridge with nothing was no longer merely surviving. She was fighting for herself, for the children, and for the fragile hope of a better future. The tension that Jameson left behind lingered like a storm cloud over the Sullivan homestead. Eve could feel it in the children's questions, in Jacob's silence, in her own restless dreams. But with each passing day, life pressed forward, and in the small acts of daily labor, bonds began to weave themselves quietly, almost invisibly. She rose each dawn with the rooster's crow, the hem of her dress brushing dew-soaked grass as she carried water from the creek. The children often joined her, their chatter lightening the load. She found herself teaching them as much in chores as in letters, showing them how to scrub dishes without wasting soap, how to mend torn hems, how to knead dough until it rose soft and golden. One afternoon, as she guided little Clara's hand through the looping letters of the alphabet, the girl leaned her cheek against Eve's arm. "It's easier when Mama helps me," Clara murmured, her voice half asleep from the warmth of the fire. Eve froze. The word hung in the air like fragile glass. She had not expected it. Not yet, not so soon. Her heart clenched with a sharp "uck," torn between longing and fear of overstepping. But when she glanced at Clara, the child's eyes were calm, innocent, expectant. She swallowed the lump in her throat and whispered, "Then we'll keep at it, sweetheart, until the letters dance off the page for you." From that day, the shift began. The youngest children clung to her skirts, bringing her wildflowers or tugging her hand when they scraped their knees. The middle ones began arguing over who could sit nearest to her during supper. Even Daniel, slowest to bend, began showing cracks in his armor. When the calf strayed too far from the corral and Eve marched after it with stubborn determination, Daniel had rushed to help her, muttering under his breath but grinning despite himself when the animal finally yielded. Still, Eve feared the word mama. She worried it dishonored the woman who had once filled this house, the mother whose memory lived in every corner. She tried to correct the children gently, to remind them she was Miss Eve, nothing more. But the word returned again and again, unshaken by her protests. The turning point came on a Sunday. The family rode into Silver Ridge for Mass at Father Miguel's small chapel. The wooden pews groaned with the weight of miners' families, ranchers, widows, and orphans. Eve sat surrounded by the Sullivan children, her hands folded tightly, in her lap. She felt the stares, some curious, some hostile. She knew whispers still circled about the widow who had moved into Jacob Sullivan's house. When the service ended, a group of town women lingered by the chapel door, their words pitched loud enough to carry. Imagine that, setting herself up as mistress of a house with 6 children. No shame at all. Likely she's after his land. Poor children, calling a stranger mama. Eve's cheeks burned. She quickened her steps, shepherding the children toward the wagon. But before she could speak, Clara spun toward the women, fists balled. Her small voice rang out, "Clear and fierce. She's our mama now, and you can't say different." The words cut sharper than any insult. The chapel yard fell silent. The women stiffened, their faces flushed with indignation. Eve froze, tears stinging her eyes. She reached to hush Clara, but Jacob's steady voice broke through the stillness. "That'll be enough," he said, his tone quiet but final. His gray eyes swept the crowd. "This family answers to no one but God." He lifted Clara into the wagon, then offered his hand to Eve. For the first time, she did not hesitate. She took it, climbed aboard, and sat beside him as the horses pulled them away. The children's chatter filled the air, light, defiant, proud. Eve sat with her hands trembling in her lap, her heart aching with a mixture of fear, humility, and wonder. Our mama. That night, when the children had fallen asleep and the house lay quiet, Jacob lingered by the fire. Eve sat across from him, mending a shirt sleeve with careful stitches. For a long while, neither spoke, the crackle of wood the only sound. Finally, Jacob said, "They see you as more than help." Eve kept her eyes on her stitches. "I've tried to correct them." "Don't," Jacob replied, his voice low, steady. "They're right." The needle paused in her hand. Her throat tightened. She dared a glance at him. His eyes were soft in the firelight, filled not with the stern reserve she had come to expect, but with quiet gratitude. "They needed a mother," he said. "And I reckon I needed someone too." Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the needle. She set the mending aside, pressing her palms together to steady them. The weight of his words sank deep, warming her and terrifying her all at once. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that this bond was no longer mere duty or arrangement. It was something chosen, fragile, but real, kindled in the crucible of hardship. And though neither of them dared call it love yet, the foundation had been laid. The high summer sun lingered too long over Silver Ridge that year. Clouds passed over the basin without breaking, leaving the land brittle and cracked. Grass withered, the creek shrank to a sluggish trickle, and the cattle bellowed with thirst. By August, the dust lay thick as flour on every surface, coating lips, stinging eyes, and choking breath. Eve rose each morning to fetch water, but the buckets grew lighter with each trip. What once had been a quick chore now meant walking farther down the dwindling creek bed, kneeling in the mud to scoop enough for cooking and drinking. She rationed it carefully, pouring small cups for the children while saving only a swallow for herself. At night, the household lay restless, the air heavy and unmoving. Even Jacob's stoic strength seemed strained. He spoke little, but Eve saw him staring at the horizon, jaw set, as if daring the heavens to relent. One evening, as she scrubbed the last of the dishes with precious drops of water, Daniel slammed through the door, his shirt soaked with sweat. "Pa, the south pasture's dry. The cattle won't last another week if we don't move them." Jacob cursed under his breath, pushing back from the table. The younger children fell silent at his tone, eyes wide. Eve set the dish aside, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can we do?" she asked quietly. Jacob's eyes met hers, and for once there was no wall between them, only weariness. "Drive the herd west, toward the river. It's 2 days. Ride." "But that means leaving the little ones behind." The silence pressed thick. Eve understood at once what he was asking, whether she could manage the household alone in his absence, with food dwindling and heat bearing down. "I'll manage," she said firmly, surprising even herself. Jacob studied her, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he almost smiled. Then he nodded once. "You always do." The next morning, Jacob and the older boys drove the herd out, in a cloud of dust. Eve stood with the younger children at the fence line, shielding her eyes against the rising sun as the wagon disappeared over the ridge. Fear gnawed at her, fear that Jacob would not return, fear that the drought would claim them before relief came. But fear could not boil water or fill bellies. She turned to the children, straightened her back, and said, "All right, we'll make do. God helps those who help themselves." And so began the trial of survival. Eve led the little ones into the dry garden, coaxing what she could from withered stalks. She showed them how to pull up onions that had clung stubbornly to life, how to grind dried corn into meal, how to stretch a single loaf of bread across 2 meals. She rationed every crumb, every drop. At night, when the children asked if there would be enough tomorrow, she smiled and said, yes, even as her own stomach ached from hunger. The heat pressed harder. Anna, still frail from her fever weeks ago, wilted beneath it. Eve fashioned a fan from straw and sat by her bed, brushing damp curls from her forehead, whispering songs until the child slept. When tempers flared from thirst and exhaustion, Eve refused to let anger take root. She gathered the children in the evenings, reading aloud from the worn Bible Father Miguel had given her. Her voice wove through the dim room like a thread, binding them together. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. She read one night, her voice steady though her lips were parched. For they shall be satisfied. The words soothed more than food. On the 4th day, just as Eve's hope thinned to a thread, the sound of hooves thundered across the yard. She rushed to the porch, her heart leaping. Jacob rode at the head of the herd, his shirt torn, his face streaked with dust, but his eyes alive. Behind him, the older boys drove the cattle, leaner but still standing. The children cheered, racing to meet them. Eve stood frozen on the porch, tears burning her eyes. Relief washed over her like cool rain. When Jacob dismounted, he moved stiffly, exhaustion radiating from every step. But his gaze found hers at once. For a long moment they stood in silence, the world narrowing to the space between them. You did it, he said finally, his voice rough. Eve shook her head, swallowing back tears. We did it. He reached out then, hesitated, and brushed his calloused hand lightly against hers. It was not a kiss, not yet. But it was more than duty, more than gratitude. It was a vow without words. We face this together. That night, as the family gathered around a meal scraped together from the last of the stores, Jacob bowed his head in prayer. His voice, low and reverent, carried through the dim kitchen. Lord, for this roof, for this food, for this woman who kept my children safe. Thank you. The children echoed softly, Amen. Eve's chest swelled, her throat too tight to speak. She glanced at Jacob, and in the flicker of lamplight, she saw not only a father desperate to hold his family together, but a man slowly allowing himself to hope again. And in that fragile hope, love began to take root, not sudden, not loud, but steady as the first drop of rain after drought. The drought broke with a sudden storm, lightning tearing across the sky, rain pounding the basin until the parched earth drank greedily. The creek swelled, cattle lifted their heads to drink, and the homestead breathed again. For a brief span, hope returned, but storms of men do not vanish with the weather. Jameson came back. This time he did not come alone. His buggy rolled into the yard behind a pair of mounted deputies from Silver Ridge, their badges glinting in the sun. Eve stood on the porch, her apron dusted with flour, her hands trembling as she watched the men dismount. The children gathered. Behind her, their eyes wide, Daniel instinctively moving in front of his younger siblings. Jacob stepped out of the barn, his stride unhurried, but every line of his body taut as a bowstring. Mr. Sullivan, Jameson called, voice dripping satisfaction. As I warned you, the consortium cannot allow lawless teaching to spread unchecked. These men carry writs authorizing the closure of this so-called school. Any who resist will answer to the law. The deputies shifted uneasily, as if they knew this was less about law and more about power. Eve's heart thundered. She clutched the doorframe, shame and fury rising in equal measure. Everything she had built, the lessons, the hope in those children's eyes, could vanish in a stroke of ink. But before despair could choke her, Jacob stepped forward. His voice was calm, low, carrying the weight of a man who had once kept order with a badge of his own. You know as well as I do, this isn't law. It's fear dressed up in paper. My children will learn, and so will the others. No man in a suit will decide otherwise. Jameson's smile sharpened. And when your house is burned? When your cattle are driven off? Will you stand so tall then? The words sliced through the air, a naked threat. The children gasped. Eve felt her knees weaken. But Jacob did not flinch. He turned his head, his grey eyes steady, and for the first time he addressed her openly, his voice strong enough for all to hear. Then we'll stand together, and if the town means to stop us, they'll have to reckon with the Sullivans as a family. The word family struck like thunder. Eve's breath caught. She saw the deputies glance at each other, uneasy in the shadow of his conviction. Jameson's smugness faltered for a heartbeat. Later, when the men finally left, muttering, their writs unanswered, their intimidation broken by Jacob's refusal, the house settled into tense silence. Eve remained on the porch long after the dust of their departure faded. Her hands gripped the rail so tightly her knuckles whitened. Jacob joined her at last. He stood a moment without speaking, then said quietly, they'll come again. Harder. Next time, she turned to him, her voice raw. And when they do? What happens to the children then? To the school? To us? He met her gaze with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. Then we give them something they can't tear apart. Something bound by law, by church, by God. Her breath hitched. The meaning hung heavy in the air. He did not kneel. Jacob Sullivan was not a man for grand gestures or fine words. But his eyes, tired, unyielding, vulnerable in their honesty, spoke plainly enough. Eve, he said, her name almost a prayer. Marry me, not for duty, not for appearances, but so no one can touch what we've built here. You've given, my children back their laughter. You've given me back something I thought I'd buried. Stay. As wife, as mother, as part of this family. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the porch, the fields, even his face. Her heart pounded with terror, with hope, with the memory of every humiliation that had told her she was unwanted, unworthy. But those voices seemed distant now, drowned out by the sound of 6 children who leaned against the windows, watching, waiting, already calling her mama. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Yes. Jacob exhaled, a sound half relief, half vow. He reached for her hand, rough and calloused, and for the first time held it not as duty, but as promise. That evening, Father Miguel arrived, summoned by a rider Jacob had sent days before. The priest smiled warmly when he heard the news, his weathered hands blessing them both. The Lord has a way of making families out of the broken pieces, he said gently, and a way of protecting what he joins. Plans were made swiftly. The churchyard would host the wedding, the town invited to witness. It was not merely a marriage, it was a declaration of defiance against the consortium, a stand that said faith and family could not be bought or bent. As Eve lay awake that night, the children breathing softly around her, she realized the weight on her chest had shifted. Fear still lingered, yes, but so did strength and belonging, and a love that had crept in quietly, steady as dawn after the longest night. They dressed the churchyard with what the basin could spare, wild daisies woven into twine, a quilt hung from the cottonwood like a banner. Long tables borrowed from the saloon, scrubbed with lye until the wood showed pale and clean. Miners. Wives arrived with loaves wrapped in cloth. Ranch hands brought smoked beef and jars of early peaches saved against want. Father Miguel's bell rang once, twice, then settled into a steady toll that carried out across the basin like a promise. Eve stood in the vestry's tiny mirror, smoothing the skirt she'd stitched from her best black and a strip of white, muslin. It wasn't a bridal gown, only a widow's dress refashioned with careful hands. but in the light slanting through the window, it looked like dignity. Clara arranged a crown of little white daisies in Eve's hair and stepped back. "Breathless. You look like Sunday," she whispered. All the way through. Outside, Jacob waited beneath the cottonwood in a clean shirt and his good hat. He had shaved close. The lines time had graven into his face looked softer, not erased, only owned. Daniel stood to his right, shoulders squared, jaw set with the seriousness of a man given weight to carry. The other children gathered around Eve in a small constellation, blinking up at her as if they feared she might float away. People came. Not just the faithful who filled Father Miguel's pews each week, but saloon keepers in their Sunday coats. The blacksmith with his hands scrubbed raw, women with ribbons tucked shyly into their hair. Even a few miners in filthy shirts stood at the gate, embarrassed to come closer, hats twisting in their hands. It wasn't curiosity alone that brought them. It was the lived knowledge that a home could be remade, that a future might be taught like letters on a slate. Father Miguel lifted his hands. "We are gathered," he began. The buggy rolled up then, iron wheels crunching on the hard-packed yard. 2 mounted deputies flanked it, and in the buggy's shade, Theodore Jameson's smile gleamed like a blade. The crowd's murmur dropped to a tense hush. Eve felt the children edge closer until their shoulders pressed against her skirts. Jacob did not move. He only turned his head slightly, and the small tilt of his chin said, "We knew this was coming." Jameson climbed down, dusted his sleeve with delicate distaste, and raised his voice. "Friends of Silver Ridge, I congratulate you on your festivities." His eyes slid to Eve, then to Father Miguel. "But before we consecrate anything today, business must be done. The consortium cannot permit an unlicensed school to operate. The ladies' efforts will cease." No one answered. A wind hissed. Through the cottonwood leaves, Father Miguel's face was stern as carved oak. Jameson gestured to a deputy. "Read it." The man unrolled a paper, voice stiff. "By order of the territorial superintendent, any instruction outside authorized facilities, subject to closure." Jacob spoke, quiet but carrying. "You read your paper on Mineland once before. It didn't take then either." Jameson's smile thinned. "Churchyard or no, Mr. Sullivan, the law is not swayed by sentiment." "Good," Father Miguel said, stepping forward. His robe flared in the breeze, the little brass cross at his collar flashed. "Because this is not sentiment. This is charter." He produced a sealed document, heavy paper, red wax stamped with a bishop's ring. He held it high so even the men on the edge of the crowd could see. "By authority of the Diocese of Santa Fe and recognized under territorial statute for parochial instruction, the Sisters of Charity will oversee a parish school at St. Bartholomew's, using the Sullivan homestead kitchen until such time as a room may be raised. Mrs. Eve Morrison," he looked to her and nodded gently, "is appointed lay teacher under my care. Any interference here is an offense to church and law both." A breath moved through the yard, part relief, part wonder. Miners exchanged looks, hope cracking their wary faces. The deputies shifted in their saddles, glancing sidelong at Jameson. His jaw clenched. A red spot rose at the hinge like a coal. "Yuku. Hide behind vestments," he spat softly. "But money writes the future here." Jacob stepped to stand between Jameson and the dais, where Eve waited. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. "Money tried to write my family's future," he said, voice steady as a plumb line. It failed. Jameson's gaze slid past him to the children. "You think a kitchen and a widow's stories will keep them from the mines?" Eve felt the old shame rise, then break. She took one step forward, voice clear. "No, their own minds will, once they've learned to use them." A ripple of low laughter and approval moved through the gathered crowd, not mocking, but something like pride. The blacksmith snorted. A miner raised his hat and called, "Let the lady speak." Jameson's face smoothed to that cold boardroom, calm. "We will revisit this, with men who carry more than paper." "You already tried that," Jacob said. "And you'll find more here than a paper too." He turned, not to Jameson, but to the people. "I wore the badge in this town. Once. I know what fear does. I know what it costs to stand. Today I ask you to stand with us, not for Sullivans, for your children, for a school that doesn't teach them to bow." Silence followed, the heavy kind that can decide a future. Then a woman in a faded blue dress stepped forward, a baby on her hip, 2 boys behind her. "My Tom coughs black dust," she said, voice shaking. "If books can spare the little ones from that, I'll bring wood for the stove every morning." Another voice. Old Mr. Keegan, half blind, lifting his cane. "I can't read a psalm to save my life. Teach the boy. I'll mend your fence for payback." The small tide became a swell. Hands rose. Offers tumbled out. Planks for benches. A stray bell from the freight office. A crate of slates saved from a burned school in Abilene. Community has a sound when it finds its courage. It is the sound of people remembering they are many. Jameson saw it, and for the first time the confidence drained from his eyes. He flicked his gaze to the deputies. They held their reins and did not move. He leaned close to Jacob, voice low. "This isn't over." "No," Jacob said, almost kindly. "It's begun." Jameson mounted, gathered his reins, and wheeled the buggy sharply. Dust rose around his wheels as he drove away, not with triumph now, but with the hard, brittle speed of a man outnumbered and newly aware of it. Father Miguel let out a breath like a prayer. Then he turned to the dais and lifted his hands again. "As I was saying," laughter rippled through the crowd, easing the tightness in Eve's chest. She reached for Jacob's hand. He took it. The children flocked to the front, Daniel straight and solemn, Clara glowing, the little ones blinking, like owls in daylight. "Do you, Jacob Sullivan," Father Miguel began, "take Eve Morrison to be your wife?" "I do," Jacob said, before the words had fully left the priest's mouth, the first quick answer of his life. "And do you, Eve?" "I do," she whispered, and found the words were not fragile after all. They were iron, hammered thin, yes, but strong. There were no gold rings, only a band Daniel had braided from clean leather the night before. Jacob slid it gently onto Eve's finger. The leather warmed against her skin. When Father Miguel told him to kiss his bride, he did so with a reverence that lifted the yard into a hush. No grand flourish, only a long, steady promise sealed in. The space where breath meets breath. The bell rang then. Someone had found the rope, wild and joyful. Children cheered. A fiddle struck up a tune no one quite remembered until their feet taught them again. Bread broke. Hands were shaken. The miners who'd lingered at the edge walked forward like men entering clear water after years of dust. Eve stood on the church porch, watching it all, Jacob's arm around her waist. The threat had not vanished. The company would move again in offices and ledgers. But today, the family had taken a name in front of God and neighbors, and the school had taken a shield. Today, humiliation had been rewritten, line by line, into belonging. She pressed the leather ring with her thumb and felt it answer back. "We begin." Autumn came early that year, bringing the smell of wood smoke and the first crisp winds across the basin. The drought had passed, but its memory lingered, written in the deep cracks of the earth and in the thinner herds grazing the ridges. Life was never easy in Silver Ridge, but now it carried a different pulse. The Sullivan homestead had become something more than a house. It had become a hearth for the whole community. Each morning the children of miners and ranchers trickled in, their boots scuffing against the porch, hands gripping slates and scraps of chalk. Eve met them at the door with the same patience she'd given the Sullivan children, teaching letters, guiding sums, reading scripture and stories until their eyes lit with understanding. She had begun with 6 children and a chalkboard propped on the table. By November, more than 24 crowded into the kitchen, the youngest perched on stools, the eldest crouched near the hearth. The little school became the heartbeat of Silver Ridge. Mothers came with baskets of bread, fathers dropped off kindling. Even the blacksmith sent nails and planks to repair the roof. It was not charity, it was ownership. The town was beginning to believe that learning could build a future stronger than ore pulled from the mountains. But belief carried danger. The Western Mining Consortium did not forget its defeats. Men loyal to Jameson lurked on street corners, whispering that the Sullivans were stirring rebellion, that the school was a trick to keep children from honest work. Once, a stone crashed through the homestead window during lessons, sending chalk dust flying as children screamed. Eve gathered them quickly, her voice calm, though her hands shook. Jacob rode into town that night and returned with a firm set to his jaw. After that, no more stones flew. The message had been delivered. Through it all, Eve's bond with the family deepened. The children no longer hesitated. They called her Mama without pause, without guilt. Daniel, once stiff and distrustful, began sitting near her after chores, asking questions about the world beyond Silver Ridge, about books, about how laws were written. He no longer tested her with defiance. He tested himself, and she guided him with pride. Even Jacob changed. The man who once filled silence with stoicism now filled it with quiet partnership. He rose early with her, carried buckets, split wood, and when the day's labors ended, he lingered by the fire with her as the children drifted to sleep. Their conversations were few, but the weight of them was more than words could carry. His presence became her anchor, his steady hand brushing hers not out of duty, but devotion. The marriage that had begun as shield grew into something stronger, a slow-burning love built not on romance's fireworks, but on the daily endurance of 2 people who had chosen to belong to each other. The school's fame spread beyond Silver Ridge. A traveling newspaperman stopped one afternoon, curious about the cluster of children chanting sums in a ranch kitchen. He wrote an article about the Sullivan method, a widow and a rancher, teaching frontier children with nothing more than chalk, scripture, and stubborn faith. The article reached Denver. From Denver it reached Santa Fe. By spring, territorial officials sent word. They wanted to see this kitchen school themselves. When the letter arrived, Eve sat at the table, her hands trembling as Jacob read it aloud. "They want us to come to Denver," he said slowly, as if the words themselves were unbelievable. "They want you to present how you've done it here." Her heart pounded. She thought of the station yard, of the jeers, of her satchel clutched like a lifeline. She had once stood as nothing more than a humiliated widow with no place in the world. And now governors and legislators wanted her voice. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm just—" Jacob reached across the table, his calloused hand closing over hers. "You're the reason this works, Eve. The reason they come. The reason these children believe they're worth more than a pick and a shovel. You can." The children gathered close, their eyes wide with pride. Daniel straightened, his voice sure. "Mama, you've already taught us. You can teach them too." Tears blurred her vision. She nodded slowly. "Then I will." The day of departure was bittersweet. Neighbors crowded the yard, offering blessings, loading the wagon with food for the journey. Father Miguel pressed a small wooden cross into Eve's hand. "For courage," he said gently. As the wagon rolled away, Eve looked back at the homestead, the porch where she had first stood in fear, the fields where Jacob's children had once kept their distance, the kitchen that had become a schoolhouse. It no longer looked like a stranger's house. It looked like a legacy. And deep in her heart she knew, this was no longer just her story. It was the story of every child whose laughter had returned, every family who had dared to hope, every mother and father who now believed education could free their children from the mind's dark grasp. The widow who had been humiliated at the station yard was gone. In her place stood a wife, a mother, a teacher, and, though she scarcely dared the word, a movement. Years do not stop for storms, nor for victories. They move steadily, grinding hardship into memory and joy into something quieter, steadier, enduring. For the Sullivan family, the years were marked not by wealth but by growth. The kitchen classroom became a cabin wing built by neighbors, then a one-room schoolhouse painted white against the Basin Hills. By the mid-1890s, that little school had multiplied into others, homesteads across the territory copying the Sullivan method, where kitchen tables turned into desks, where widows and ranch wives became teachers, where children who once would have picked coal from tunnels instead learned to read scripture, to tally accounts, to dream beyond the mines. Eve's days were no longer defined by humiliation, but by the hum of voices reciting lessons, by the scrape of chalk on slate, by the laughter of children spilling out into the dusty yard. The sound was its own hymn, its own prayer of thanksgiving. Jacob grew older, the weight of years bending his broad frame but never dimming his watchful eyes. The cattle still needed tending, the land still demanded sweat, but his greatest pride was not in herds or acres. It was in the children who grew into men and women carrying books beneath their arms, who wrote letters back from Denver, Santa, Fee, even Washington. The Sullivan children each found their own path. Daniel became a teacher himself, stern but kind, carrying his mother's memory and Eve's lessons into towns where no schools had stood before. Clara, once timid, grew into a nurse, her tender hands easing the pain of others across the frontier. The younger ones scattered too, building families of their own, but always circling back to Silver Ridge, to the place where their lives had been remade. And Eve became more than wife, more than mother, more than teacher. She became the quiet symbol of a movement. Her name was spoken in meetings in Denver, cited in government papers debating the future of rural education. Yet she never sought recognition. When officials tried to praise her, she only smiled, smoothing her apron, and said, "I just did what was needed." But those who knew, the children who had once huddled in her kitchen, the neighbors who had watched her stand against jeers, the husband who had once offered his hand in silent defiance, they carried her name like a torch. In the autumn of her final years, when the basin's cottonwoods burned gold and the schoolhouse bell rang across the hills, Eve sat on the porch with Jacob. Her hair was silver now, her hands thinner, but her eyes were the same steady flame. The children's children ran in the yard, their laughter echoing into the wide horizon. Jacob sat beside her, his weathered hand clasped around hers. "They gave me everything," she whispered, voice soft as the breeze. Jacob turned his head, his grey eyes still unyielding, still hers. "You gave it back to them tenfold." When? At last the grave marker was set, simple stone beneath the cottonwood. It bore no grand inscription. Only her name, her years, and the words the children had chosen. Mother to many. The story did not end there. The Sullivan method became the backbone of rural education across the frontier, carried east to Washington, west to California, north to the Dakotas. Long after Silver Ridge itself changed, long after the mines closed and the company men faded from memory, the legacy endured. A widow who had once been humiliated in a station yard now stood eternal in the minds of generations, as the mother who turned kitchens into schools, shame into strength, despair into hope. And so the story of Eve Morrison was told and retold, not in books at first, but in the lives of children who no longer bowed to the mines, in families who believed learning was worth more than ore, in towns that rose because one woman refused to yield. Her beginning had been marked by jeers, her ending by reverence. Her life, like the land itself, had been harsh, unyielding, but beautiful. And her love, steady as the horizon, endured in every lesson, every child, every home that echoed with laughter where once there had been silence, And to those who hear her story now, remember, the frontier is not only hardship and dust, it is also the place where love and resilience can carve legacies that outlive stone and steel. The screen fades to the wide horizon, children's laughter carried on the wind. She came with nothing but sorrow. She left with everything a heart can hold. This is the story of Eve Morrison, the widow who became mother, wife, teacher, and the root of a movement. The channel emblem burns into the final frame. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true tales of love and redemption in the Wild West, because some legacies never die.